You're watching WAAY 31 News, a community conversation.
Peaceful protests with messages of hope and a better future. Turned to tear gas and dozens of arrests in the streets of downtown Huntsville. Tonight, a community conversation focused on North Alabama's future. Our town hall tonight is made up of 6 guests from law enforcement, city government, religious organizations, and community activists. We have Jerry Burnett from the Huntsville-Madison County NAACP, Kenny Anderson, the Multicultural Affairs Officer for the City of Huntsville, Lauderdale County Sheriff Rick Singleton, Mitchell Walker with the Greater Huntsville Interdenominational Ministerial Fellowship, and Rabbi Eric Burke from Temple B'nai Shalom, and Bruce Jones, who's worked with at-risk youth for more than 2 decades. And thank you all so very much for being with us for this very important conversation tonight.
And we really appreciate you being here. Jerry Burnett, we're going to start with you. Set the table for us. Now, your association has organized a number of protests. What is the message that you hope to get out there with these demonstrations?
Oh, the message that we hope to get out there is that if you want change and you want real change, keep calm, relax, register and vote. Make sure you put politicians in office who will change policies that will benefit you and what you are trying to accomplish. And with that, we can, if we want to see real change, we got to change policy. When we change policies, we can see a change coming.
And this question is for Kenny Anderson, the Multicultural Affairs Officer for the City of Huntsville. Do you think that these protests will lead to actual change? And what conversations have you had with city leaders at this point?
Sure, that's my desire. I think that protest without purpose is futile. And I know that right now this is an important time for people to be given an opportunity to express themselves, to talk about how they feel, and also to exercise their First Amendment rights to free speech. And at this time, I think that it's important for people to gather peacefully, to be able to express themselves in positive, productive ways that can also gain the attention as well as the engagement of city leaders, which I think is the goal of much of what we're seeing right now. And of course, I would hope that at the end of that process that we see systems begin to change because people are engaged, people are strategic, people are intentional, and moving just beyond the protest to processes of advocacy as well as activism.
Lauderdale County Sheriff Rick Singleton is also with us. Sheriff, thank you for being here. Obviously, you have a duty to protect lawful protests, but when does it cross the line? What do protesters need to understand about this?
Well, they certainly need to obey the law, and you know, the destruction of property and the assault on officers who are trying to maintain peace and order, you know, just not acceptable. And, you know, as law enforcement officers, we have an obligation to our communities that we represent. We have an obligation to our citizens to protect them, to protect their property. And, you know, we need to, we certainly support, you know, the message from the protesters and the peaceful protesters, and our job is also to protect them. You know, and to make sure they can exercise their constitutional rights to protest. So it's a real challenge right now for law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. And this question is for our religious leaders in the group. We'll start with Rabbi Eric Burke. What conversations have you had with members of your congregations about what's happening in our community and from just a spiritual perspective, how we treat one another?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for asking. Some conversations have occurred within our congregation. They've ranged from disbelief to support to, I think, a righteous anger. I mean, basically, there are 2 Jewish tenets that I try to share with my congregants. The first is, in Hebrew, B'Tselem Elohim, that every human being is created in the image of God, and tzedek tirdof, justice you shall pursue.
And Mitchell Walker is joining us too with the Greater Huntsville Interdenominational Ministerial Fellowship. I'm sure you would echo those thoughts, correct?
No one endorses violence or looting or destruction of property or disregard for human life in any respect. I think that where we have reached now, not only what is being demonstrated here in Huntsville, but across the nation, is just a frustration and that has built up, and now persons are releasing it, sometimes in some unhealthy ways and some destructive ways, but there are some things that certainly need to be addressed as a result of these protests.
And this question is for the Lauderdale County Sheriff Rick Singleton. We've heard a lot, especially lately, about the need to get more minorities into law enforcement positions. What seems to be the barrier from your perspective?
If I had the answer to that question, I'd be a very popular guy. I don't know what the answer is. I've been sheriff 6 years, and we've had 3 applicants that were minorities. I don't know. What the challenge is. When I was chief of police in Florence, I sent officers to Oakwood. I sent officers to Alabama A&M and other colleges to attempt to recruit. At that time, our challenge was we weren't competitive, with salaries and benefits and so forth. So, we're sitting next to the FBI and departments like Huntsville and Nashville that, offer much higher pay, much better benefits, better retirement benefits. And so for your local smaller departments, we're just not competitive to be able to recruit. We certainly, I talked to the community leaders here in our community and asked for their input and their support. I've been on the local talk shows on our local black radio station and trying to recruit. So it's there again, it's another challenge, especially for your smaller departments.
Sheriff, let me follow up with you a little bit. Are your deputies trained in race relations? Is there specific criteria that they go through to prevent these kind of incidents that we've been seeing?
There are some, they've received training at the academy. We have had diversity training before. It's been a while. Obviously, when things like this come up, it comes back to the front burner and say, hey, we need to refresh our memory. We need to go through this again. So I'm sure that's something a lot of departments across the country will be doing in the weeks and months ahead. But it's very important. I think, again, my experiences in my 40-plus years of law enforcement has been understanding the different cultures. We have different cultures, and people react differently to situations, and a lot of that has to do with cultural diversity. So it's important that we understand that and get a grasp for that.
And Jerry, I want to ask you the same question from your perspective. What seems to be the barrier in recruiting minority law enforcement?
I think maybe one barrier is that convincing minorities that there is a need for their presence on law enforcement. So, and then if we could get more minorities interested in becoming a law enforcement officer, I think maybe we could see more minorities on force.
All right, stay with us. We're going to continue this conversation right after the break.
You're watching WAAY 31 News, a community conversation.
Thanks for joining us this evening for our WAAY 31 Town Hall, a community conversation.
And tonight we are joined by community leaders and experts from the city, government, and law enforcement, and religious organizations and community leaders. I'd like to direct this next question to Rabbi Eric Burke from Temple B'nai Shalom. In your opinion, what can we do to make Huntsville a more inclusive place of various religions, races, and ethnicities?
I believe that Huntsville is already well on its way to being inclusive and accepting. That's been my personal experience since moving here about 2 years ago. Certainly from the communities of faith here in Huntsville, having embraced me and my wife and our Jewish community, even after those recent anti-Semitic hate crime vandalism incidents back in March on the first 2 days of Passover. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. So I feel like Huntsville is, again, well on its way to meeting that goal.
Kenny Anderson, you're the Multicultural Affairs Officer for the City of Huntsville. Is that true? Is this an inclusive community in your opinion?
I think we're moving towards that. I think that there are any number of initiatives that are going on right now that represent a desire to have a community where people feel that they're affirmed, that they're respected. Among those initiatives are things like the Human Relations Commission, the Huntsville Area Inclusive Community Initiative, a lot of work that's being done by the Interfaith Mission Service. You have diversity, equity, and inclusion offices on many of our institutions of higher education. We work very closely with all of these groups and so many more, continually talking about ways that we can work together. I think one of the missing elements in this process is an opportunity for more people in the community to be engaged. And of course, we're constantly seeking ways to do that. So we post things on social media. We try to engage people through email. It's a challenge, but I think that the more we can connect with people, the more community engagement we can get, and the closer we can get towards being a truly inclusive community.
And I'd like to refer the same question to Bruce Jones. He's worked with at-risk youth for more than 2 decades. From your perspective, is that the perception that you get in dealing with our area youth?
I think we're striving to achieve those goals of harmony and inclusiveness. You know, anytime we have a situation like what has happened, it has the tendency to set us back. And without the proper dialogue and engagement and communication that Kenny is talking about, all the gains that we accomplish, we'll lose them. And that's what we have to be concerned about. I think of Huntsville and the surrounding North Alabama area as an area that is a safe place for us to live, a good place for us to live, and a good place for young people to live. And the goal is, how do we continue to set a good example for our young people? Because many times we see them behaving and acting in a way that we always will appalled by it. But yet we have to ask, they're watching us and they're monitoring us. They learn that from us. We're their role models. So where are they seeing a lot of those behaviors from? Even from the national, the federal level, the local, they see a lot of conflict and infighting, and they don't see a lot of agreement. They don't see people actually listening and dialoguing with each other for positive solutions. They see just extreme conflict. So that's what they will learn as well, and that's how they will react and respond when they're caught in situations. So we as adults, we have to make sure that we're being that role model for these young people at all times.
When you say stuff like that, I feel like you're putting a glaring spotlight on the media. How can we help in doing that? Are we showing too much of the bad and not enough of the good?
Well, one of the things that, as the director of Decatur Youth Services, we were on a regular basis doing positive things in the community to highlight our youth, to engage our youth, and to let people see our youth doing positive things. We would typically send out information asking that the media come and participate with what we're doing, because we wanted the community to see it. We don't always get a response. I mean, very seldom will we get response when we were doing positive things that the community needed to see. So we were always concerned that if a young person got killed or there was gang violence and somebody was, many people was injured, well, you guys would have been there. But when we were doing events and programs to deter gang activity and doing whiz plays and things like that, we didn't see you guys a lot. So I would definitely say we need to see more of you highlighting, spotlighting the positive things that kids do, because kids are they're very easily influenced. So if they see those type things being spotlighted and highlighted, they want to be a part of that because it's something good, and they can build from that. So I definitely think you need to spend more time finding positive things and identifying those things and letting the community know what is going on when young people do positive stuff.
Right, well said.
And same question for Lauderdale County Sheriff Rick Singleton. This situation has really put a spotlight on some of the challenges that law enforcement face in terms of systemic racism. But do you feel like that you're always portrayed in a negative spotlight? What are the conversations that different law enforcement officers are having?
Well, I certainly agree with the previous gentleman. It's, you know, we also try to be proactive and do positive things in the community, and it's really difficult to get any kind of media coverage on those. I think one of the best things we've done in law enforcement in recent years is the School Resource Officer Program, and one of the goals of that program was to establish a rapport with the younger generation. I think where we're really missing the boat right now in law enforcement is we need to connect with the young African American males 18 to 30 years old. That's, you know, they, as a population, they commit a disproportionate amount of the crime, and they have the disproportionate amount of interaction, negative interaction, especially with law enforcement. And we need to somehow find a way to open the line of communications with those young men. I think that would also help us in the recruiting that we were talking about earlier. We're missing the boat there, and we've got to find a way to have dialogue with that particular segment of our population.
Jerry Burnett with the NAACP. Sheriff Singleton makes a good point. How do we reach that group?
How do we reach the group?
The young black men coming up in the community.
Mm-hmm. I think if we did more advertisement, more recruiting, and pass the message in the area where there's a number, where the population is where lots of young men is in the population in the community. If we could pass the word through that, well, to them there, I think we could do a better job of recruiting.
Well, stay with us. We're going to continue the conversation right after the break.
You're watching WAAY 31 News, a community conversation.
And thank you for joining us for our evening of WAAY 31's Town Hall, a community conversation.
Tonight we are joined by community leaders and experts from city government, law enforcement, religious organizations, and community leaders. So this next question is for Kenny Anderson, the Multicultural Affairs Officer for the city of Huntsville. And from your perspective and based on what you see, is there a lack of minority leadership in North Alabama?
I don't know that there's a lack of leadership. There may be a lack of representation. I think that there are a lot of people in the minority community who lead various organizations and have an opportunity to do so in the community, are well known, well respected, and well supported. Are opportunities available for all? I think that might be a question that people need to look at. Our council president recently challenged the council to think about board representation and making sure that our boards for the city reflect diversity and inclusion. I think it would be smart across the spectrum of our community to do the same thing with regards to nonprofit organizations and otherwise. I think there's a plethora of leaders and individuals who are willing to step up and lead. I think the key in that aspect, though, is where are the opportunities? And so I think a lot of opportunities exist, but I think there's room for a lot more.
I wanted to step back for a minute, back to these protests. And Jerry Burnett, if you could talk to us a little bit about the NAACP obviously planned some peaceful protests. We've talked about that. There was a big one in Big Spring Park a few nights ago. But take us inside that protest, and how did it devolve into what we saw in downtown about an hour and a half later?
I think the misunderstanding came in when there was a number of participants who wanted to march. And of course, they may have gotten the wrong message, but we was having a rally, and it didn't include marching. And so when the people found out that there would be no march, it kind of upset some of them, and they decided, well, we'll march on our own. But then that was not a part of the NAACP. We was only there to do the rally in the park and then break up and go home. But it didn't turn out that way. But all of the NAACP participants that I'm aware of knew that there would not be a march until, you know, so we after we break up, we just went on home, and of course, the other people were on their own.
And so, Jerry, moving forward, what would your message be to people who take part in protests?
I didn't, say it again?
Moving forward, what would your message be to people who take part in protests?
Oh, as I stated at the rally, the main thing we need to focus on is to register and to vote and to change the policies that's in place. And once we change the policy, too many people don't understand how the system works. I mean, there's too many that refuse to go to the polls, and then they think that they can change the policy by protesting. Well, protesting is good because it brings awareness to the problem, but to get to the real root of it, we have to put politicians in office that will make policies that would change it. You have to change it from the legislative process. And then once it changes, it becomes law. And then everybody have to abide by the law. So
let's bring Bruce Jones back into this conversation. You've been working with the youth in North Alabama for a couple of decades now. So how do we do that? How do you bring up this next generation to make a positive change in this community through positive action?
Well, let me go back to the question that was asked about how do we get more minorities involved into the police force and that. Well, you know, we have a program. I say we. I've been retired for 4 months, so I hadn't let go yet. But we had a program called PALS, Police Activity League. The purpose of the program was to get the police involved with the kids in these positive activities, coaching, plays, whatever. And it was very difficult for us to get the police to come and actually be a member and participate and lead, coach, or whatever. Occasionally we get 1 or 2, but just to get an overwhelming number of police just to be a part of that, it was difficult. I feel like if the police was involved with the kids on that level, the kids, because we're adults, or they're role models, they see those police officers as role models. They see those police officers doing something positive, engaging with them. When they see them now, they see them arresting their brothers or pulling them over if something happens. And I'm not saying that's always the case, but they do see it from a negative light because they don't get to see that positive interaction. If they get to see that positive interaction, now the next thing they're talking about is, hey, I think I want to be a police officer. I want to be like Officer John there. Man, he's really cool. Those are ways that we can get kids involved in those positive things. But if we don't, as a police officer or police departments, take the time to really engage in the community in those type positive ways, then they will be seen in these negative lights because the only thing they will see is what they see on TV or what they see in their community, and that's not always good.
And so, same question to Sheriff Rick Singleton. In your opinion, how do you, just from a grassroots fundamental place, get these minority communities and minorities to want to be a part of the force?
Well, I certainly agree with everything the gentleman just said. I mean, it's about community involvement. As I said a while ago, one of the best programs we've implemented in the last few years in law enforcement was the School Resource Officer Program, where we do have that kind of interaction with the kids at school. But it's got to go beyond school. And, you know, it's very refreshing when you see posts on social media where officers are playing basketball with the kids in the neighborhood. I saw a picture here the other day where an officer had gone by the Boys and Girls Club and bought the kids ice cream after work. You know, those kind of things, and absolutely what the gentleman said. Most people who have an interaction with law enforcement, it's not in the best situation. You know, you know, no one calls the police when everything's going well. So it's not a good environment and unfortunately a lot of people judge law enforcement strictly by their own personal interaction, which a majority of the time is not a good situation. So we absolutely need to do a better job of getting more involved in the community. Again, one of the challenges is with the younger generation that we're employing now, and it's not just law enforcement. You know, civic clubs. You look at your civic clubs across the community and look at the demographics of the clubs. The average age in a lot of those clubs is 70 years old. You know, the younger generation is just not getting involved in a lot of things. And you know, the first and foremost thing about law enforcement is it's made up of human beings. And, you know, they've got the same desires, the same, you know, interests that other people have. And unfortunately, a lot of our citizens today just don't have an interest in civic and community involvement.
Interesting. And Kenny, it sounds like we're hearing a common theme here, and that theme is involvement. Involvement from the youth all the way up. It includes everyone, but we've got to get more young people involved.
Yeah, we do need to get more young people involved, and I would suggest that young people are heavily involved right now. What we need to do, perhaps, is be more intentional in how we involve them to establish and support mentoring programs that are already established out there, not just through funds, but through our presence, our ability to be able to direct them and guide them, to help them participate in processes that are important to the overall working of the city. That includes things like city council, school board, et cetera. We've got to expose them to those kinds of things. I want to step back for 1 minute, though, on the question of getting minority young people on the force. That indeed is one answer to the challenge that we're facing, but that's not the only answer, and that may not even be the dominant answer. I think the dominant answer is, in addition to providing opportunities for minorities to join the force, is to elevate the degree of respect for people in the minority community, to be able to enhance the quality of relationships between law enforcement and communities of color. I think that involves a lot of community engagement where people are proactively engaged, and I think that we see a lot of evidence of that here in Huntsville through programs like Community Awareness for Youth, which is a program that I direct out of my office, which was started in the Huntsville Police Department many years ago. It is a back-to-school program where there's sort of cross-engagement between them, the police and the community, and I think that's extremely positive. Our crisis intervention training program focuses on minorities and also mental health issues that works to strengthen those particular relationships. And I think that there's great opportunity for the community to be proactively engaged in strengthening the foundation of communities of color with law enforcement communities, so that when challenges arise, you're not talking to strangers, you're talking to friends, you're talking to people that you develop relationships with. I grew up in New York City, and there was something called the Police Athletic League. This was a group of police officers who provided sports training programs for people of color in the communities. They provided uniforms for us. They made sure that we had access to ballparks and equipment. And I think those kinds of things are so important to be able to strengthen the relationships. All success in life is relational. And we got to start early, we have to be consistent, and we have to do it often.
Thank you, Kenny. A great perspective. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You're watching WAAY 31 News, a community conversation.
Thanks for joining us this evening for our WAAY 31 Town Hall, the community conversation.
Tonight we are joined by community leaders and experts from city government, law enforcement, religious organizations, and community leaders. Confederate monuments have been in the news a lot, and a push in many communities to bring them down, and whether they still should have a place out in the open and in our community. So let's take this question to Mitchell Walker with the Greater Huntsville Interdenominational Ministerial Fellowship. What is your perspective on Confederate monuments?
Well, monuments, Confederate monuments raise for those of us who are African Americans some bad memories, some hurts. They represent something that was defeated, that still is being, in one sense, idolized as something that is significant for everyone. And so to move those, at least relocate them from where they are, for example, in our downtown area on our courthouse property, is certainly significant. And I think what that would do is, someone mentioned to me earlier, maybe an hour before we came on, they described where we are right now as the pot is boiling over. And I think what needs to be done to help simmer at least the heat, that will certainly help. But we can't just wait until we arrive at these critical junctions, these pivotal points where there are emergencies and crises. We've got to figure out ways to continue the conversation when we're not in emergency mode. But certainly moving that monument would certainly be important. I know that does not sit well with part of the community, but for those of us who are African Americans, it represents something that is hurtful and historically that has been harmful to us.
Kenny Anderson, you work for the city of Huntsville. Dr. Walker just advocated for removing that Confederate statue down by the courthouse. You must walk by that every day. What's your opinion on that?
I think it's important for us to talk about how do we move forward. I think that these symbols of oppression and that these symbols of a war that was a terrible experience in the United States still stand today. I think that they, if they're going to be displayed, they should be displayed on private property, not public property. That's a conversation that all people should have in this community, and I think that that there should be an opportunity for people to express their feelings about this, and that there should be strategic methods to go about finding ways in order to be able to make the environment better. You know, it's important for us to remember this, that a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the discomfort in our nation today has a lot to do with insensitivity. It also has a lot to do with the deeply embedded institutionalized and structural racism in our nation today. That's undeniable. It doesn't matter what people want to do to put window dressing on it. It is what it is, and consequently, it has consequences. And so it's important for us to look at these types of challenges that we're facing. And we see that there's a wave of movement around our nation where these symbols, again, of oppression are being taken down. That they're being relegated to places that are either private or storage facilities where they are better displayed or better stored. You know, if you were a black person or are a black person and you had to constantly be faced with something that represented the oppression of people for 400 plus years in this nation through many of the ways in which that oppression was expressed, and in many of the ways it continues to be expressed while we're seeing some of the protests today, not just around this nation, but the solidarity around the world with black people in America. I think it's worthy of people having a meaningful conversation about how do we move forward.
There certainly is a lot of anger out there about that topic, and many aren't going to wait for the legislature to get around to removing these statues. And we want to talk to Bruce Jones, bring you back into this. What do the young people say about these Confederate monuments and statues?
Their experience with it is negative as well. They haven't seen even if you want to look at it from the history books and all of that as well, their experience of it has been negative. Do they see statues of positive black men and black women who have sacrificed and contributed to this great nation? They don't see a lot of that. You know, they need to see symbols and emblems of heritage and pride for them as well. And when they have to see, you know, Confederate, and plus they've read about it, and you know, and they supposed to be able to have some type of, I can't say pride in reading it, but they supposed to read this and study this in our history, and for whatever reason they got to take a test on it, and that's can you understand from the oppressive point of view, that's tough, that's difficult. And then we give that month of Black History, and then that's supposed to be pride and enough to tell black kids that you are somebody, you are special. And so how do we empower them? We empower them by allowing them to see positive black men and black women who have sacrificed and made contributions, and then they learn about what they did, and now they come back and do those same things in our community. So I definitely I believe that it's not nothing that they can be proud about, and unfortunately that's what they're having to live with. And they're angry, and you're seeing that behavior come out of them. They want to see more positive black men and women that are spotlighted, that are highlighted, that they can say, hey, they look like me and they contributed to this great country.
And I want to direct this question back to Kenny. We recently heard Governor Kay Ivey say something along the lines of that these Confederate monuments are a part of Alabama history that can't be erased. What is your response to that?
My response to that is that this is exactly why elections matter, and every election matters. If there are legislators who want to continue to hold on to the past, if there are leaders who want to continue to hold on to the past in spite of progressive movements, the desire of people to eliminate the oppression of the past, then this, again, just for me, highlights the necessity of people registering to vote, as Mr. Burnett said, because elections matter. I think that we need to hold people who we put into office accountable for the decisions that they make. And I think that's why every election matters. If the Alabama state legislature made this law, if the governor passed it, if people are not happy about it, then they need to exercise their right to speak out, and they need to exercise their right to vote. This is something that I think represents a great opportunity for the power of the people to be exercised at the ballot. And in doing so, I think that when people challenge things that they're not comfortable with, that it's important, again, that people are held accountable for the choices that they would make while they are in office. And so it's important for people to think about the larger picture here. It's one thing, if you move the memorial, and I'm okay with that, to remove the memorial. I think that's the right thing to do. But you still have, as I said earlier, you still have policies in place. You still have various procedures in place that perpetually oppress people, perpetually keep people in a system of institutionalized and structural racism, and whether that's through experiences such as implicit bias or something that's even more intentional and deliberate, these are the conversations that we need to have to move people forward. And people need to be challenged at every turn with regards to the choices that they make regarding these matters.
All right, thanks, Mr. Anderson. Stay with us. Our community conversation continues right after this.
You're watching WAAY 31 News, a community conversation.
Thank you for staying with us this evening for our WAAY 31 Town Hall, a community conversation.
Tonight we are joined by community leaders and experts from city government, law enforcement, religious organizations, and community leaders. And let's start this block with Jerry Burnett from the NAACP. We were just discussing this. There are Confederate monuments, as you know, all over Alabama, here in North Alabama. From your perspective, do they still have a place in our community? Why or why not?
Oh, my take on the Confederate monument is that it should not be displayed in public because it's an insult to the black community when you look at it and you glorify who was really a criminal organization that tried to overthrow the United States government because they did not want to set their slave free. So at the time that Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the southern states knew that his plan was that abolish slavery, and rather than to set their slave free, they said, well, we'll take our slaves and we will leave the Union. So in order for Abraham Lincoln to pull the country back together, it became a civil war. And the fight was, no matter what people said, they said state rights. Well, states' rights don't give you the right to own a human being. And when you said the war was about states' rights, well, the states' rights was that they wanted to have the rights to own, buy, and sell human, which is an insult to the black community when we talk about glorifying people who try to oppress the entire black community and to make them work for free. And that's my take on it. I think it was all about preserving slavery. And before they say we'll set our slaves free, we will start a civil war and we'll overthrow the United States government. And had the South won, slavery would have continued.
And these monuments are just painful reminders for that community.
True.
All right. Thank you. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Thanks for joining us this evening for our WAAY 31 Town Hall, a community conversation.
We just wrapped up an hour-long conversation with community leaders and experts from city government, law enforcement, religious organizations, and community leaders.
You can find the whole conversation online at waaytv.com. Thanks for joining us.